Hi, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. I'm Chris Lucian, and my co-host is Austin Chadwick. And today we're here with Mark Shead to talk about leveling up in mobbing, effective remote teams, BDD, TDD, the state of software development, and much more. Being a better engineer and all that. But before we get to that, Mark, thank you. Welcome to the show, and can you give a brief introduction?
Good to be here. We have a small company that we work on big projects, oftentimes helping teams, mainly as an agile coach, but helping teams get more value out of the investment they're making in software. And usually when we're successful, having a whole lot more fun doing it. So I've worked on a lot of projects for the Federal Reserve Bank and Treasury and projects like that, as well as some startups. We're doing some stuff with a bovine genetics company in town. I just got back from a meeting from there, and that's a interesting area that kind of shows where I'm situated in rural America. Also run a Agile Lunch and Learn, Agile L&L, which Austin was gracious enough to join us here a while back, where we get together and get interesting people to talk about things related to Agile and software development every Tuesday. So that's me.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's jump into it. And I mean, your context sounds really interesting and probably more different than a lot of software developers out there. So that's pretty cool. So I'm interested in how mobbing ended up in that context, and then maybe we can talk about leveling up the entire team as we go.
Cool. Okay. Well, so like I said, a lot of the projects I work on have been with the Treasury, and oftentimes working with large organizations that are recognizing that the approach of getting 50 people on a team and just throwing it at a problem for 5 years may not be the most efficient way to work. So a lot of my success stories come around from saying, no, you know what, instead of doing this with 50 people, let's try 5. And let's see if we can get them firing on all cylinders and really delivering well. And then if we need to add more people, we can. And oftentimes what ends up happening is you discover that you can do more with those 5 people, really, really ultra focused, than you can do if you have 50 people stepping on each other's toes and maybe not really knowing exactly what's going on. One project I remember for the Treasury, where one of the early ones I worked on, it started out with 5 people kind of working independently and just kind of being heads down. Everybody would disappear for 2 weeks and then come back and show what they were working on. And they were very talented people, so a lot of stuff got done. But we finally introduced as a team something that was scary for a lot of people, but the idea of pair programming, saying we're not going to touch code unless there's 2 people looking at it. And it was very, very uncomfortable for everyone for just a few weeks. After doing that for a while, though, they got really, really good at working together in ways that they had never worked together before. And the cycle time went down and the amount they were delivering went up dramatically. So the next stage from that was, since they were used to working together, they found there were some things that it was better to have even more than 2 people working on. And that's kind of my introduction to mob programming, was being on a team that kind of organically developed to that, just by saying we get more done when we're working together than we do when we're working by ourselves.
Oh, that's awesome. So I guess based on the transition from solo to pair and from pair to mob, maybe what were the, I guess, big moments or big differences as you went from, because you kind of talked a little bit about pairing and the cycle time. And so was it just a net improvement going to a mob, or were there other things that were discovered? How did that work out?
So I think my experience on this, I was coming into this particular project as an agile coach, and mostly on the technical side of things, trying to make sure that they weren't running into impediments on using different technologies. But what we found was, when everybody was working independently, even though they were very, very smart, there was always a big chunk of things that you did not know. The one person working on it did not know about. And so when we kind of instituted that hard rule that we were all going to work and make sure we weren't going to touch code unless 2 people were working on it, it changed the way the team started working together. Because previous to that, what would generally happen is, if we were, this was using some Spring and some different things, but there was one particular aspect of the application that somebody was working in. If a story came up that touched that piece of the application, the person that would end up with it was the person that had always worked on it before. which sounds like a really good thing, right? Because you got the person that knows the most about it working on it. That's the most efficient way to work. But it turns out that if you're working on a project for many years, that's not necessarily the most efficient way to work. So when people started pairing, what was happening is when a new story would come up, somebody would usually raise their hand and say, hey, I don't know anything about this. I have no experience on this. I would like to be the person that takes this story. And then somebody else would say, okay, well, I've worked on this in the past, so I can probably help you. Let's work together and do this. And what ends up happening is you end up with the knowledge of the application spreading like a cold in a kindergartner classroom, right? It's just pretty soon you don't even realize how it's spread to everyone. And not just the technology of the, not just the, knowledge of the application, but I remember there was one situation we were sharing screens with people and doing something, and somebody they weren't a developer. And this was early on in the project. I thought they were a developer just because they're really smart. Turned out they were on the business side of things. But he was doing something at the command line, and he did something. I was like, wait, what'd you do there? And so it was some key sequence that I didn't know you could do in Linux. And so I learned something as part of it. And if those types of things are happening hundreds and hundreds of times a day, you get really smart, really fast on the things you need to know to do well in your application. And that just doesn't happen if I'm just going to disappear for 2 weeks. I'm not willing to ask for help. My sense of self-worth is tied to the idea that I'm not going to ask anybody or tell them that I'm struggling with anything. I think that's one of the big things with pair programming that happens, and mob programming as well. But if I'm working on something by myself and I can't figure it out, it becomes part of my identity that I need to fix this to get through it. That this shows that I'm smart. If I'm working with you and I know you're smart and I can't figure it out and you can't figure it out, I now have social proof that this is actually a difficult problem. And we'll give up way sooner if two of us are working on it together than if one of us is just heads down, spends a week doing something and someone says, oh yeah, you need a comma there, or whatever it is, that simple thing, or don't do that, that doesn't work, here's the other way to do it. So I think a lot of the value that I've seen coming out of programming with other people is just being willing to give up and ask for help way before we will if it's just me working on it on my own.
Mm. Yeah.
Does that sound like what you guys see happening too?
Yeah, all the benefits of a virus spreading through a kindergartner's classroom.
That's not necessarily the best way to sell it to me.
No, yeah. Just joking. No, absolutely. Just the spread of ideas is remarkable. I think the diffusion of innovation can happen much faster, right? Your early adopters find out sooner, they start experimenting sooner, they then proof of concept out, you get an early majority in, it crosses the chasm easier, that sort of thing. So like an idea, a good idea has a much stronger chance of surviving than than it would if everybody's solo, because one person may give up on something where others may continue working through it. And so especially with groups of mobs and people sharing ideas between mobs and things, you can get some really magical benefits from that, from the standpoint of developing out a strategy or creating a new idea or anything along those lines. So yeah, it totally resonates.
And one thing interesting about what you just said, nothing you mentioned was tied to typing, right?
Yeah.
There's no need to optimize for the number of keystrokes that we type, but oftentimes that's how we work, is based on the idea that, if we could just type more letters more quickly, we'd get somewhere. But ideas are very different than that. And if you're optimizing for ideas, maybe you de-optimize for the number of lines you can type, because that's not really the important thing. It's getting the ideas into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you get the rapid experimentation on that. And kind of going back to your original question, Mark, on you didn't use the word sunk cost fallacy, but that's what came to mind. And when you're talking about like that's when you're alone and you are like the knowledge silo, the expert in that one area of the code, right? Your identity is in solving that. Yeah, I think I really haven't observed that since I've been mobbing about 6 years now. That I think it's funny because it's almost unnoticed that doesn't happen, just because if there's more than one person observing the problem, the brainstorming to solve it, to either try something else or continue the path and fix that path, just kind of happens, right? Quite naturally, because someone else is seeing the air and with you, and then they just start throwing out ideas or running experiments or saying, hey, instead of, you know, going up this side of the mountain, let's go to this other side of the mountain and see what happens, you know. And yeah, I definitely see a lot of that. Like I love the I think what mobbing's probably most well known for is it like the katas you would see, right? Where it's like a very known problem like FizzBuzz, and then people going through the mobbing exercise, right? With, you know, changing driver, navigator, and that kind of thing. But also really fun part of mobbing is you have a really hard problem and we're trying to figure out the best R&D approach to solve the problem, right? And so where you have lots of different approaches to get up the mountain, so to speak, being tried out together in sync or, you know, on each other's laptops and being shared. And I feel like that's just a natural part of pairing and mobbing, is exploring different alternatives. Yeah, so there's a long-winded answer to your question.
Now, you mentioned something just there that you haven't seen, and I want to make sure I understood it. You haven't seen people get to the point that they're feeling they can't ask for help. Like, you haven't seen that for a long time.
So there is a corollary problem. I think since if you are pairing or mobbing, you are asking for help without asking, basically, to everyone who's in your pair and mob. A corollary problem I have seen is when a pair or mob is uncomfortable to ask outside of help, outside from that little group, right? I'm pretty quick on the trigger to be like, let's pull in Chris, or let's pull in someone else, or let, you know what I mean? Like my amount of struggle is like like an hour a day tops before someone else is, you know, pulling someone else in. I've seen others are less comfortable pulling people in. And I guess there's pros and cons to that, right? I guess you're interrupting others less. But as far as resolving bottlenecks goes, just pulling more minds until the bottleneck is gone usually evaporates the bottleneck pretty quickly. So
that's interesting, because one thing, and thinking back this team, the first team that I was talking about where we were doing the pair programming, what was interesting is we started out with that, or started out by just kind of working in their own little silo, and then switched to where they were, you know, mandated pair programming, and then relaxed that requirement for this particular project. And they were doing some mob programming, but not exclusively. And what they ended up doing is the culture had shifted because they were used to having to work together. Even when they went back to work by themselves, they would go, I mean, they'd get 30 minutes into something and go ask somebody else for help. And they would have never done that before. And so, or never done it that quickly before. So it was interesting. And this team, I was remote. So I was viewing into the team room. We had several people remote, and most of the developers were co-located in San Francisco. So I could see the team room. And it was a marked difference from the way people were working before, where everybody's just kind of hunkered down, heads down, working on stuff, where then they went to the pairing. And then when that requirement was relaxed, there'd be like two people pairing here, somebody over here by themselves, but you'd see them get up, go ask them a question, and then go back. And the culture had shifted where it was acceptable to ask questions and ask for help. And before, it wasn't there for whatever reason. So I think that just establishing that norm, but you also mentioned the idea of going from one pair or a team to go ask someone else. I wonder if rotating who you're working with sometimes makes that easier, because then you've got that relationship with people that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, so I do agree with that. I think that if sometimes a mob will stay together for longer periods of time, and I think one of the side effects of that is that that at least the cross pollination doesn't happen, and sometimes problems do not get communicated outside of a single team. But you know, I think there's something to be said for a couple of situations that I've seen recently. Like, I have seen it where opening up a large group chat for sort of asynchronous communication about an issue happens. Sometimes people, but probably to Austin's point, likely after a longer time, would do like a department-wide, does anybody know about this thing, right? And so, I think that there are different levels of communication and different levels of asking for help. And I do generally think that, yeah, when you're solo, it's very hard. When everyone's solo, it's very hard to ask for help. When there's mobs, at least the barrier to entry is very low. It's like, hey, can I come mob with you for a bit, or will you come mob with us for a bit? And and then it's not even so much a request for help, although that's maybe what it is. Maybe just the asking to mob together will then allow the problem to be exposed organically, like that sort of thing.
Well, and
Yeah.
there's also the rubber duck thing. If I have to explain this to multiple people, I may eventually realize what I'm doing because I've had to put it into words what I'm actually facing.
Yeah, 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 exactly. Yeah, and I think it's kind of like the ketchup bottle effect. I really like how you pointed out identity earlier, because if your identity is in knowing yourself, or even within your team, knowing within yourself, right? Where if your identity is okay with not knowing and like saying that to the whole department or whatever,
Yes.
your identity is comfortable with that, then once people see that start happening, it becomes much more fluid, whether that's kind of synchronized rotations or ad hoc rotations, like, hey, we need your help, and you a thing, you probably know a thing we don't know, come on in, you know what I mean, or vice versa. And so I think that is probably the core of the issue, right? Is how do you get that going such that it's what you observed, right? Where you saw people, reaching out for help when they needed help, right? Because I almost can like feel the back and shoulder pain when I remember, I think what company was I at? But where I was working, and I was struggling hardcore, couldn't figure it out, and felt like I just had to keep just jamming on the keyboard until I could figure it out. And talking to anyone else felt like a major intrusion into their work, right? It's an offensive move. Versus now where it's like, I'm comfortable telling Chris like, hey, I don't care who you're meeting with, come over here now, no, but not that quite aggressive, but it's fairly aggressive. Yeah.
Is some of that because you've developed enough confidence in yourself that you're confident to ask to basically say, hey, I don't understand this, and maybe early on in your career you weren't?
It's probably very related, right? Yeah, the more, yeah, I guess there could be two kinds of experience, right? I think I've had the kind of experience where the more you know, the more you don't know, and the more you acknowledge that that's not a major problem to not know something. So,
the reason I thought that is I was working with this was a project for the U.S. government, and I had worked with them for a number of years, and then I rolled off and on something else. And I ran into one of the ladies that worked on it. I don't know, 6 months later, said, hey, how are things going? And she's like, we really miss you. I was like, oh, well, that's always good to hear as a coach that was on the team. But then what she said was, I wasn't sure to be proud of it or not. She's like, you ask the questions, the really dumb questions that no one else is willing to ask. And I was thinking back, and I guess and sometimes it was I didn't understand it. Sometimes it was I assumed other people didn't understand it. But what she was recognizing was valuable is there was a fear of asking questions. And either because I had been on the project long enough, or I felt that I was a coach, and you can get by with doing things as a coach because they like, oh, he probably knows, he's just asking, so I had like this social insulation that it's okay if I ask stuff because they'll assume I'm in my coaching role. But the thing that she saw was really, really valuable is I was just willing to ask the questions that other people were scared to ask. And that kind of stuck with me and made me realize the more we can make it comfortable for people to ask questions, the better the team's going to be able to move forward. There was another example. I was working with this team, and I'd come in to help them with BDD and Cucumber and some things like that. And they were getting ready to write this fairly important system to prevent fraud and stuff. And they had come up with this architecture they wanted to use. And it was, they had lines all over the wall. And so I'd been there, I think about 4 or 5 weeks or something like that. And I'm looking at this thing every day and I'm thinking, I don't understand this. And it's kind of like, the emperor has no clothes and no one's willing to say anything because I'm supposed to be the smart person that they hired to help with stuff. And I'm looking at this architecture and saying, if I needed to do X, I have no idea where I would put it in this architecture. So finally, we were talking about it again, everybody's nodding their head and everything. And I finally said, I don't know how to use this. I was like, it doesn't make sense to me where if we were building a piece of something, I don't see how I would do it in this architecture. And now keep in mind, this has been 4 or 6 weeks of everybody being fully bought into this. And once I said that, the floodgates opened. Everybody else was like, yeah, I don't understand it either. And we found no one understood this architecture. Except for the manager that was kind of pushing for it, I think may have understood it more, but no one else. So we were like, okay, let's skip doing this. We've been thinking about this for 6 weeks, and we all admit that we're intelligent people and we can't figure this out. But it made me realize how difficult that is sometimes to say, I don't understand this, because we were all doing it. We were all doing the exact same thing. And I just luckily happened to be the person, like the kid, like the emperor has no clothes. I just happened to be the person that first to say that. But if no one had said that, I don't know how much we would have built before we finally admitted it to each other that we didn't know what we were doing.
Right. Yeah. I think it's a personal development thing to be able to be willing to do that. And it's also a system thing. Like, I think, I find myself having foundation. If your foundation is outside of the thing you're working on, it's easier to take risks, right? And to be like, maybe everyone will think poorly of me now for, like what you said, for saying I don't understand what this architecture, right? Or saying, hey, what's going on over here, right? I've noticed I tend to do that in sports leagues I'm into, like I'm coaching, and I'll just walk up to another coach and say like, hey, what's going on over here? And then it leads into a fiasco because no one's ever asked that guy that, and then expose some weird thing that was going on in the corner of the league. But it takes some level of personal and system safety to be willing to do that. Either the system is safe such that you can do that and not be fired or something, or some bad consequence like you lower pay or you don't get a raise or things like that, or your safety is outside of that system, and so it's not the end of the world if you
don't care what people think, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so I think, I was talking with you, Chris, once about that, right? That level of willingness to take risk is sometimes what helps the system move along, or
Yeah. Well, so I think the way I put it was kind of always be in a position to, act virtuously regardless of whether or not you are going to lose your job. So if you're afraid to lose your job, then the status quo is kind of uncontrollable, right? And so to an extent, you need to be able to do the right thing uh for the way you see it, and doing the right thing without fear of losing your job. Now, asking a good question is like something of doing the right thing. And I don't say this in like the sense of being disruptive or anything along those lines. So still following the processes and things like that. But those behaviors like asking lots of questions or just doing something that you would, kind of reflect and say, this is a virtuous behavior. It's like if in a hostile environment, if you behave as if you have psychological safety, even when you don't, then either the environment will get better or you will be selected out of the system. But you have to be okay with that. So, having enough of a financial cushion or something like that. But if you get caught in the trap of always worrying about that, then the quality of your decisions will just follow the organizational average, right? So that's kind of maybe that's a long-winded way of saying it.
That's good. I think there's also something to be said for trying to make sure you amplify and provide safety is one way of thinking. But if somebody asks a question, recognize that might have been hard for them to do.
Yeah.
And make sure you reward isn't, but like you say, that's a good question stuff, because if somebody you may ask a question and get a very good response to it and it be helpful, but you still might feel uncomfortable with that. And trying to highlight that we need to do more of this is, I think, important. I was working with it was this organization, and the project manager that became a scrum master wasn't super tech. I mean, she wasn't a developer. She was great and awesome, but she was trying to understand the technical aspects of a bunch of security things and stuff like that. And I remember she'd ask me something, and then later she'd come back and ask me about the same thing the next week or something like that. She's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry for asking this again." And I was like, "No, you keep asking, because this is really valuable for you to understand. And I am great with explaining it every time you have the question. Just keep at, if you've ever got a question, ask, because we'll keep going over it, because you knowing this is so valuable. It's worth investing in.
Yeah.
So don't, it's never an inconvenience to me, because this is how we move the project forward." And she went on to be very, very effective at her job, because she had enough technical context for things to steer around some really big boulders that were coming up. But it was an uncomfortable thing for her when she realized I'd asked this before and I thought I understood it, but now I realize I don't. And when we kind of got past that, where she was like, "Yeah, I know I can ask Mark the same question every day if I need to," I think it helped us make some big steps forward. But that wasn't her natural inclination. It's probably none of our natural inclination to feel like we can ask questions over and over again. So we have to make that comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it reminds me of keep going back to sports things, but this last season of baseball coaching for me, I had two assistant coaches who knew way more than me for this level, even though I was, quote, the head coach, right? And so there was a little bit of the intro phase where, you don't necessarily want to walk in the room saying, "I know nothing and I'm leading this team. Isn't this wonderful?" You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
But, once a certain level of comfort was reached, they'd be like, "Hey, we need to work on the XYZ thing." And I'm like looking around and I was like, "What's the XYZ thing?" And they're like, "Oh, you don't know? Okay, that's fine." And then they'll teach me and send me videos, and then I'll go research, and then we'll go do it together. Or I'll be like, "Hey, can you lead the XYZ thing at the next practice or whatever?" Right. And so, but just finding that wiggle room for, maybe it has to start like it did with you, with like one-on-one with someone else. And that's like the genesis of, hey, at least with these two people, they can say what they don't know and learn from each other and share. And then you can kind of see it spread, as time goes, from two people to three to four. But once you have that, like, the amount that you learn from each other just grows so fast. And I'm going to say it again. It's like kids, spreading a cold in the classroom, right? It's just so wonderful.
The recurring theme.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it might be a good time to kind of
Sure.
move along on topics. So maybe you had a note here about effective remote teams. What were you thinking about this?
So for all the technology we have, I'm amazed at how poorly we seem to do as a industry at working remote, at least most places. There seems to be, is still everybody kind of working in their silos and stuff, and then they'll schedule meetings. And when COVID hit, I was working with the Federal Reserve Bank at the time, and it was interesting because COVID hit, and then for a lot of their developers, their schedule was just 8 hours a day of meetings that had been scheduled. Because if you wanted to talk to someone, you have to. So if I needed to talk to somebody in management, it was like, okay, 3 weeks from now, their calendar is completely booked till 3 weeks from now. And it was interesting within this one team I was working with. I was pushing very much for a virtual team room approach. So like, let's try to replicate what we do. We'd go and sit in a team room together. Let's have a team room that we're all going to hang out in. If you need to drop off or something, that's fine. But this is our space where we are at. We join in the morning and we get to this space. We'll probably chat some like we would if we came into the room normally, but there's a space and people can find us here. So there were multiple teams in this. So every team had their own kind of team room. If you needed to see somebody from someone, you just hop over to it. And what that did was it broke that schedule thing to where people were scheduled all the time. Because if I needed to talk to you, I knew I could probably find you first thing in the morning in your team room, or at least ask and they'd know where you were. So you were in these virtual spaces, but it was like chasing someone around a building, like, "Oh, we saw him over here," which sounds like it might, or you text them and say, "Hey, where are you?" "Well, I'm over here talking to someone. Come on over here and let's talk about it." It also, so that was within this team, but what ended up growing, and I've seen this happen on some other projects as well, what ended up growing from that is you didn't have to, if someone needed to talk to your team, they didn't schedule an appointment for tomorrow. They just hop into the room and have the conversation with whoever's there. And if the person not, you go grab someone somewhere else. And I find very few teams are actually working like that. That doesn't seem to be what people, and I think part of it is people are like really freaked out about being on video. And I was talking to somebody at the DevOps days, KC in the Spirit, like, oh yeah, I'd never want to do that. And I remember being there when I was joining a team that was doing that. I was like, yeah, I wouldn't, somebody watching me all the time, but if I'm in person, I don't feel like I've got to put a paper bag over my head. That's not in my mind that I can't be seen. So why is it any different? I don't know. What do you guys see?
Well, I'd say, so the teams that we work with are kind of all working that way. So there are open rooms all the time. There's a camera icon with the icons of the people currently in that room, so people can actually see where people are. If they're on hold, then they show up as being on there when they're away. But that also is easily, you jump in, you see the person's not there, you can jump out. And so that style has been very effective for us, in my opinion. I don't know, Austin, if you have another perspective on that.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. And one thing that jumped out to me is because I've noticed the video thing or even the audio thing too, that people, I think it kind of goes back to with COVID, the Zoom fatigue. And I think a very formal, I don't want to say high quality, but kind of almost like what we're doing here, high quality mics. We're all looking at each other face to face. It's very as if you were in a room with each other and like sitting in a tight circle talking face to face. So if someone thinks about that, being in a team room like that, 8 hours, it does sound quite draining, right? But if you compare that to kind of what in-person team room is like, it's actually quite informal, right? I'm not staring at you, Mark, for 8 hours as we talk, and work together, or Chris, like that would be quite creepy to do in person. But it almost feels like that's what people think they have to do in a Zoom meeting or an audio video or a team room of some kind. And so I've done things to try to make it impersonal on purpose. Like when I mob off of a phone, and it's almost like, I think someone described it as like being in the cockpit. It's like off to the side, kind of like the side view almost. But when we mob in person, that's what we do. It's not like I'm staring at you face to face. When we work on the code, we're side by side, right? And we're working on something together, or we're on the whiteboard together, or that kind of thing. And allowing for awkward pauses and all the kind of stuff that happens in person where I might be going, for, that's not great speech if I were giving a formal speech, but it does establish a level of humanness and commonality that like, hey, you don't have to be like like you're on stage right now. You can relax and just think and, work through it. And so
Next time I mob in person, I want to just take a whiteboard, and anytime I want to be off camera, I'm just going to put a whiteboard in between me and the rest of the mob and say I'm going off camera, and I'll just talk to them across the way. That might be the equivalent of off camera. But I totally agree with you. Like my camera's over here on an arm, and I have the code typically up over here. So I'm looking here and typing.
Yeah.
And when I'm going to go talk, I talk over here.
Yeah.
I think that the Zoom fatigue thing, one thing, at least in my experience, some people may experience it a little bit differently, but if what I want is a window into my team, the team room, I do not want that to be where I'm looking at code, because then I can't see you. And the thing that's creepy is if my code covers up the people that I'm talking to, now it's like I'm behind a two-way mirror and people are looking at me that I can't see. And that, that is a little bit, weird. And then you forget about it. And, but if I've got a separate monitor that's just like you guys are on a monitor with a built-in camera, it's just for this. I'm not putting anything else on it. I can look up at you. I can look down at my computer or over at my computer if I want to. And I think I think some of the Zoom fatigue was just us not using the technology that's there, even more so than being tired of technology. Yeah, granted, it does take a little bit of getting used to.
Yes,
the idea that you're talking about. So I get that it will be uncomfortable at first, but I think a lot of times people don't try to fix to make it more comfortable. They just assume they don't like it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so kind of in light of time, I'm just going to combine the next three things, and we can go wherever with the conversation. So TDD and BDD, the state of software development, and learning to be a better software engineer. So there might be some overlap there, maybe not, but maybe we can just kind of jump into it and go wherever.
So kind of the thing that probably hits a lot of these things is I think our software industry is if you look at how we build bridges, right? We build bridges and we know what they're going to do. It's not like we build a bridge and then drive out on it and say, I hope this is going to work. Or what was, and I think this is a legend, but the idea that when the Romans built a bridge, the architect and his family would have to sleep under it the first night to prove that they really thought it was not going to fall down. But whether we did that or not, that's not how we approach building bridges now. It's not like, I hope this is going to work, right? We know how things are going to perform. And I think the software industry is still at the stage of, we're going to build it and then let somebody sleep under it and see if it's going to work, because we don't really know if the code we're writing does what it's supposed to. And I think that's where particularly BDD and TDD, as far as the process of getting to BDD, is really valuable and probably dramatically underused. Because I think we don't usually start off by thinking, how do I want this to perform? How would I prove that this performs the way I expect? And starting there and then figuring out how we're going to write it. I think we oftentimes start off with, here's what I want it to do, which is a very different question than asking, how do I prove this does what the customer is asking for? So I think as far as becoming a better software engineer in the state of software development, that's what's going to get us to, whatever the future, whatever, that will get us to a better future than I think we may be headed to otherwise.
Yeah.
So maybe Roman style development will be, the compiler every time you have a bug report come in, then you get a shock or something to share the pain from Microsoft shares.
Nice.
But I certainly agree. I don't see people using TDD often, and everything is very experimental. I do think that there are kind of like experiential aspects that where we genuinely don't know how the UI UX will feel, for example. But once things are totally locked in, then or what you're going to be maintaining or going forward, and if you're more in systematic and farther away from the UI UX piece, then the necessity of being sure like goes up and up and up. And so yeah, I mean, it certainly is hard with the state of software development, because there's still a lot of people out there that are like, why would I waste my time with testing and all this other stuff?
Well, what you just said, I'm going to interrupt you because I want to ask a question about what you just said. So the idea that you're building something, and since you don't know what the UI is going to be like, you can't specify the behavior of it and lock that into a test. Is that what you're saying?
You can, but locking it into a test in some cases can make things less flexible, right? So your speed of iteration on a UI that is experimental may go way down, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't create better ways of doing that. Like, for example, the Lean UX book, certainly has like the napkin drawing version of the UI, or just cut out pieces of paper so people interact with the UI. And so I think a lot of these advanced UI UX practices don't get used very often. And so the specifying those things feel harder to people in those scenarios, right? So if you had somebody that has done a lot of iterations on the UI with experimental UIs and put it in people's hands that worked with mockups in Canva and things like that. If you have the budget to have a person doing that, then often you can unit test right away or BDD right away, right? But there's a potential opposition, especially if you don't have the budget to do that, where if somebody's iterating on their UI UX with functioning code, that the incentive is to not be testing, right? So it's getting better at those iterations without committing to code, right?
I think so. My experience, because I understand where you're coming from. I think there is maybe more value. So a lot of what I see is when people are saying, "Oh, well, we don't know what this is going to look like, so we can't write it in BDD." I think so I get the idea that this is going to change, so we want to be careful we don't have to redo too much code. But I think sometimes we're way too scared of evolving our BDD scenarios
Hmm.
to the point that we're actually slowing ourselves down instead of speeding ourselves up. Because if I get even the simplest workflow, this workflow is going to have 10 things, and I'm like, well, I can just put all the information on one page and then have a confirmation page, and this lets me get feedback from the customer. It's really, really ugly, but I've got a BDD scenario that proves that this works because other people are changing other things, and if they break something, I want to know about it. Well,
Yeah.
then the next stage, we get that working. The next stage may be to break some of that up into more stages of workflow. I'm gonna have to come back and change my BDD scenarios in order to handle that. But if I'm comfortable with the idea that, yes, just like I'm going to evolve the UI, I'm going to evolve the things that state how I expect it to work. I think a lot of times that is way more efficient than we realize it is, because we've got in our mind that, and I'm not saying it's always, but I think we're often too scared to change code, including the code in our tests. And we have this idea that we wrote the test, we never want to change it. And maybe if we give ourselves the permission to let those grow, there's some other opportunities we're missing.
Yeah, I totally agree that iterating on the code is important and is a roadblock for some people, for sure. So
What do
in
you think of iterating on the tests?
and iterating on the tests, yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And I think there's also different mechanisms for that. So and often I'll see, so like approval tests, like Llewellyn Falco's approval tests, where you can generate lots of assertion data and then say, yes, that looks good. And then now if it ever changes, I will need to come back, right? So for a legacy refactoring process, that allows you to iterate on both the expected result um, as well as the incoming computed result. And you can iterate on those things very quickly. And so I do think that there is something to be said for the iteration time and how malleable the code is. And that's why things like London style versus Detroit style TDD also are really important to me. And it's how much flexibility do you want to inject into somebody's workflow? So, London style locking down architecture makes it much harder, in my opinion, to refactor an architecture where but it allows you to be much more methodical about the internals of a system. But the opposite side is the Detroit style allows you to refactor very freely and very quickly, but they get harder to maintain because more tests fail, because they're not quite the traditional unit level test. So all of these things kind of bubble around in my mind on this topic.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. And I think I really liked your analogy of the Roman bridge or legend thing. And I think that was my biggest hook in XP. Was I even remember a slide I made very early in my journey and just had like this picture of, I forgot what the picture is, but it was like confidence like no other, right? And I think to your point, Chris, and the way I handle it, at least conceptually, is I have two modes, right? Are we in R&D mode, or almost like spike mode, or are we know what to do, let's test drive it, right? And
Yeah.
so in the R&D mode, we're probably going to throw away whatever we're doing if we're writing code or trying this or that or whatever. But as soon as we know what to do, boom, we switch into that test drive mode where we could throw it away or wherever you leave it, put in your notes. And now we know what to do, whether it's the design, the UI design, or the internals and all that kind of stuff. And then you can test drive it and you're out of that hopefulness that you're talking about, right, Mark? Where what is it? What did Feathers call it? Edit and pray, right? It was the the way he called it. And I'm so addicted to that. You try not to make things too much part of your identity, but it's almost part of my identity as a developer is that if that confidence is not there, I'm just kind of like, I think I'm out. Godspeed to y'all, but I'm out. You know, like I don't think I can proceed anymore without safety nets here, because we're just hoping the bridge will work. And we're like, go ahead, customers. Yeah, go ahead and walk or drive your car over this.
It's been very interesting looking at
Yeah,
some of the teams I work with that are, they're doing BDD and TDD just to humor me, because they're like,
yeah,
we're
yeah,
hiring this guy to be here. We ought to at least go, okay, we'll go ahead and do it. And there's this tipping point that happens usually like maybe 6 or 7 weeks in, or when another team starts working on stuff and they're working on the same code base. And they go from, we're doing this to humor Mark to, I never want to work any way other than this because this is so much better, because they start seeing the things where, hey, this found something in my local environment that I would have deployed, and I can see all the problems it would have. And particularly if there's another team that's not running the test, that's putting things in and breaking it all the time. And but there's this huge shift that happens. And sometimes last big project I worked on, it happened like overnight. And I came in the next day, I was like, you guys are like completely different people than who you were when I left yesterday afternoon. But it was just that, I think what you're saying, they realized the confidence it was giving them, and it was a big deal.
awesome, awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing. We are coming up on our time mark. This has been quite a good learning conversation for me. So I really appreciate all that you've brought and helped us discover. Before we close down the show, is there anything you'd like to share or plug?
I just want to mention the Agile Lunch and Learn. Go to Agile LNL, Agile Lunch and Learn, kind of like the Airbnb. So agilelnl.com. If you're interested, I don't have anything scheduled right now, but there'll be new things being scheduled. People as famous as Austin Chadwick have been there, so it's got to be pretty good stuff. But that can be a fun thing. We've got about 4,000 people that get the invites, and usually 100 to 200 show up because they're interested in that particular topic. So if you've got it coming in as an invite, you may see something you're interested in. So that's my plug. I think that's something to be valuable to a lot of people to check out.
Nice. Well, thanks again, Mark, for being on the show. Really enjoyed it. To our audience, please like, subscribe, please share, please hit the notification bell, and do all the good stuff. We love to hear feedback on leveling up through mobbing and pairing, and navigating that navigating the world of being okay to not know, and kind of sharing that ability to that kind of meantime to ask for help. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Effective remote teams, ways to make people comfortable, and the confidence that comes from BDD and TDD and things like that. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And otherwise, mob on everyone and have a good one. Talk to you later.
Bye, everybody.